Hello, I'm Dr. Paul Fitzgerald, and I am an imposter syndrome and internalized shame expert. I help people rapidly break through to self doubt, fear of failure, and feel like a fraud into confidence in 30 days or less. I've spent 25 years helping more than 6,000 people overcome their imposter syndrome and their internalized shame. Most did not have those terms, but they attended this seminar because they felt themselves repeating old self-defeating patterns. They became aware of how their imposter syndrome and their internal shame was negatively impacting their life, and it was impacting their emotional and physical health. We called the seminar Breakthrough. They were able to break through to new life and discover their true identity. My training as an imposter syndrome and internalized shame expert began in my family of origin. I was probably an accident. My mother and father were 40 and 50 when I was born. I had adult siblings. One sibling was still at home. Her name was Cora, and she became my surrogate mother. At 24, I was 7 years old. She was diagnosed with cancer and died. Emotionally, it was like I lost my mother. I was living with a mother and father who were like grandparents. My mother was so deep in her grief over the loss of Cora that I knew I had to pretend to be strong for her. Later on in life, I learned that Cora was actually conceived before they were married. I am sure my mother felt like it was God's punishment for her behavior before they were married. The family moved from rural Kentucky to northern Indiana when I was 2 years old. My mother and father had poor education. They were older than the parents of the kids in my school. And on parent teachers night, they were reluctant to go. They were so embarrassed because of their age difference and also terrified they were going to be asked some questions they didn't have any answers to. I remember walking into one of my teachers in elementary school, and she looked up and she said, "Paul, I'm glad you brought your grandmother and grandfather tonight." That was embarrassing for everybody. I caught on that if I made excellent grades and never got in trouble, they never had to come back again. In a very quiet way, the three family dysfunctional rules were present in my family. Those rules are: don't talk, don't feel, don't trust and be vulnerable. It wasn't loudly enforced, but it was obvious there. We learned to not talk about too much except the casual stuff. We learned to only express good feelings, not the bad ones. And we didn't want to be vulnerable. I became a source of honor for my mother. She knew how to use shame to manage me and manage my wayward ways. I would decide I'm going to do something outside her comfort zone, and she would say something like, "Now, what would people think of us if they saw you doing that?" And if she really wanted to make sure I was in control, I would hear, "I wonder what Cora would think if she were here and knew you were doing that." That was pretty effective. The church also helped me become more of an expert in imposter syndrome and internalized shame. The church had a lot of nice people, but most were excellent posers. The same three rules: don't talk, don't feel, don't trust, and be vulnerable, were enforced at church too. Nobody ever said them, but you knew. And shame was used as a social control tool. We overheard people talking about people who had strayed from the narrow way, and they were shaming them. I look back now, and it really was normalized trauma. You were always afraid of God. I learned that no one can wound you more deeply with shame than someone from whom you expected to receive love and grace and care, compassion. Unfortunately, my church was a deeply shaming place. Imposter syndrome often results in being promoted too rapidly. I was working part time for a denomination while I was going to school. I was in the bowels of the organization, microfilming old records. An office manager came to visit me and asked me what I know about accounting. I said, "I know debit from credit." That was enough. Suddenly, I was promoted to the payroll clerk for missionaries around the world. Then the woman who was my supervisor, her husband got sick and she had to quit. I was left all alone with it. I had to fake it but I had my own cubicle. Not long after that, a new executive offered me a promotion to assistant financial manager. Wow, I'd have an office. After he offered me the job, he asked me about my military service. I said, I've never been in the military. Suddenly he realized I was not as old as he thought. Now I had to up my game even more. Eventually, my overwork became work addiction and eventually led to a physical crash and burn. Long story short, I wound up doing a doctoral program. My research and dissertation was about internalized shame, that deep feeling that I am not enough. I'm not young enough, I'm not old enough, not pretty enough, not smart enough. Whatever word you want to put in there, I'm not enough. It's a deep, unconscious feeling that continues to play out. It impacts relationships. It impacts the ability to be vulnerable. It impacts our health and it's a silent path to burnout. For 25 years, my wife and I offered a seminar called Breakthrough to help people with their internalized shame and their imposter syndrome. They could break through to new life and discover their true identity. Imposter syndrome is characterized by a persistent self-doubt and feelings of inadequacy despite the evidence of competency. Various studies suggest that between 70 and 80% of professionals across all types of industries experience imposter syndrome at some point in their careers. A very high percentage of entrepreneurs experience imposter syndrome. Researchers found that 75% of executive women reported having experienced imposter syndrome in their careers, with more than 50% saying it affected their ability to take on new responsibilities. The result is financial loss to professionals, and employers lose long-term productivity of employees. It reduces emotional well-being and impacts the physical health of employees. Internalized shame is not simply embarrassment. It's that deep feeling of I'm not enough. Some can be wounded so deeply that they resist being helped at all. They just can't imagine being valued. While others are driven by shame to overachieve at any cost to be enough. Neither way ever works. Both internalized shame and imposter syndrome can be implanted deep in our unconscious. Like many other self-limiting beliefs, before we reach age 7 to 9, they're experienced as meaning-making experiences that are protecting us at those ages. Later, they're no longer useful and become a significant problem. They become very resistant to any way we try to logically figure it out. Well, we're no longer offering the Breakthrough Seminar. I'm still an imposter syndrome and internalized shame expert and coach. I have new and more effective skills to help people rapidly break through the self-doubt, fear of failure, feeling like a fraud, into confidence in 30 days or less. And we can do it over Zoom. No hotel rooms, no conference rooms, no travel, just the internet. You can find more about my work at www.pauldfitzgerald.com.